Listeners everywhere, welcome to the Movie Show with Joel and Ryan, the weekly fix for your screen addiction and a trusted source for discussion of all things film and television. Please keep in mind that for the purposes of this podcast, Joel and Ryan are not acting as journalists, but rather fellow moving picture enthusiasts. All of their opinions should be taken as such. Also, please be warned that while Joel and Ryan may seem like petulant children, they are, in fact, adults who may occasionally use adult language. While they promise to bleep out all the worst words, it's a good bet you will still understand what they were saying. And now, with no further ado, here's Joel and Ryan.
Like a frisbee. It's the Movie Show with Joel and Ryan. Welcome for another week. I am Joel,
and I'm Ryan,
and we're thrilled to have you here on another wonderful episode of the Movie Show. We think we have a really fun show lined up today.
We hope so.
Yeah, I think so. We're gonna take a little trip back to a very special time in movie history. Just sort of a weird little conflagration of films. But of course, to do this, and Ryan and I are very good friends. I consider, Ryan is family to me.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. And, but as much as we like just hanging out, just the two of us, things are always more fun when we can have another one of our friends join us.
Definitely.
And so to talk about these films today that we're going to be talking about, and I'll introduce that in a second. But first, let's introduce our good friend, Mr. Bryan Bevel. There he is.
Hey.
Bryan, welcome to the Movie Show with Joel and Ryan.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're super thrilled to have you.
Yeah, we should tell people who you are, kind of. Brian's been one of my best friends since he moved to the Twin Cities here. How long ago was that?
Almost 19 years ago.
So, wow, almost 19 years. I'll pull remember Tony Shalhoub's character, Monk?
Yeah.
Pull a Monk and say, 19 years? That's almost 20 years.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
It's a long time.
Yeah, Bryan is best known as, at least to us and our friends in our circle, as an amazing theatrical director. He also has appeared on stage and on screen. Bryan mostly cut his teeth in the business in San Diego.
Yeah,
San Diego.
And then
where in the world is San Diego?
Yeah,
ask Carmen.
Yeah, and then somehow, due to was it like a cruel trick or a bet you lost? How did you end up here again?
My wife had a job opportunity and we jumped at it.
It was a big win, actually. A win with the wife, and then a win with the wife having an awesome job. Those are two big X's in the win column, I have to say.
I am very familiar with that. That's how we ended up back here.
Even if you got dragged out of your stomping grounds, you got a big win there. We can all agree.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think everything off stage has been great.
There you go. Well, so today you
directed us in a show, right? I mean,
yes.
We should mention that. It's actually kind of related. It was a gangster show.
Gangster #1. Yeah.
Yep. Super fun film. One of my dad's favorite things that he's ever seen. He still talks about our late great friend Gus, and how unbelievably frightening and scary Gus was in that show. And I'm like, hey, I was in that show too, Dad. Remember? And
that's part of the fun of sharing the stage with Gus.
Yeah,
I'm in the show too. That's pretty much the whole game.
Yeah,
it wasn't that.
Yeah. So Gangster #1 on stage, leading us to a particular moment in time. We are going to hop back into the Wayback Machine and go to the year 1990 a year when the mullets were long, the bangs were high. We got into our weirdly high-waisted Jabot jeans, and our shirts changed colors with thanks to Genera. I think it was Genera Hypercolor is what it was called. Yeah,
thankfully was never that fashionable.
No, I only mention it because there
I did have a mullet, but that's
I had the mullet.
history.
I'm basically describing an outfit that I wore that is featured in my yearbook.
Oh, okay.
I was wearing my Jabot, my two-tone Jabot jeans, my Genera Hypercolor shirt, my mullet. I think I may even had like a beaded, leather strap with beads on it, necklace. Yeah, I believe I was wearing. It was either a Fossil or a Swatch watch. Yeah, I was pretty much just that catalog. It's like that's there he is. But in the fall of 1990, in the last just couple months of 1990, a weird, wonderful thing happened. 5 movies came out within weeks of each other, and all of them were gangster films, and all of them were all of them really, with the exception of one, was kind of a fresh, a new take, sort of almost a reinvention of the gangster film genre. And so that is what we are going to talk about today. This is not a countdown. We are not going to be counting down these films. We're just going to be talking about them in loving, glowing terms.
It's a tribute to the gangster movies.
Yeah, and especially of that fall of 1990.
But it's fun. There should be a lot to discuss because they all take a rather not unique, but they all take diverging approaches to the same kind of material, which should be fun to compare and contrast them without completely pitting them up against one another.
Sure,
even
yes.
though we'll probably do that a little bit.
Our favorites probably will become evident as we talk about these films. But yeah, it is not meant to rank these. It is just meant to sort of, as Ryan said, we're celebrating this weird little moment in history.
And strolling down memory lane, which is always fun to do.
Yes. And all right. So, but to quick talk, we're going to mostly be talking about 4 of these films because one of them, well, we'll mention it. And
really, 3 of them were really sort of the ones that were tip top, but there's a couple we should start with that were pretty great in their own way too.
Sure. So in chronological order that these came out. The first one is Phil Genoud's State of Grace, and then coming out around the same time, King of New York.
By Abel Ferreira. Am I saying his name right, Brian? You're a fan.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
Goodfellas by this up and coming
Scorsese.
filmmaker. Scorsese.
Martin Scorsese, excuse us. Our film teacher in college insisted that we called him Martin Scorsese.
Yeah.
Because he was told at some point by somebody that that's how it was supposed to be.
Right. I believe it's how Leonard Maltin pronounces it, and that was why Ted insisted that we.
It's never fun to over-explain a private inside joke, but I felt like that needed one.
And then the Coen brothers, Miller's Crossing, and then finally on Christmas Day, The Godfather Part 3. And and it's just weird that all of those films, all of them came out around the same, just within weeks of each other. So it was an autumn of gangster goodness.
Well, you mentioned at one point all the films in the wake of the announcement that they were making a third Godfather film. Other studios, then competing studios, kind of go to the vaults and see what they've got lined up and can get out.
Yeah,
it started with Orion, the small studio, putting out State of Grace, which was Phil Genoud, who directed it. He had just directed Rattle and Hum for U2, their concert film that they got an album out of. I mean, U2 was the biggest thing on the planet in the late 80s and 1990. And it kind of continued to be for a few more years, but he was able to, he'd never made a theatrical feature, so he was able to pretty much pick it because that had been such a big hit, as long as he stayed within a certain budgetary parameters or whatever. And the script for State of Grace had been sitting around in a vault actually for a little while. It's by playwright Dennis McIntyre, and it was on, it wasn't as formal back then as they actually have a list that they keep in Hollywood now, but it was on one of those lists of best unproduced film scripts. And he picked it up and read it and, visualized it while he was reading it. And it came up with this film. And it's really great. I love State of Grace. I saw it sort of unwittingly, walked into the theater one, early autumn afternoon and with no expectations of what it was going to be. And when I talk about it, I'll probably jack expectations up. I don't mean to do that. You shouldn't do that with this movie. It's better if you kind of go into it a little blind, but it's great. It stars Sean Penn as this guy who goes back home to New York and reconnects with his friends from his childhood. And they're all gangsters in the Irish mob in Hell's Kitchen in New York at a time when gentrification and just all the moves that were happening in organized crime at the time were they were basically eliminating this, there were no Irish street gangs in New York anymore by 1990. That was a late 70s thing. And, that wasn't how stuff laid out. So the movie is metaphorically and beautifully about that. It's about the dying of a thing, the dying of a neighborhood, the dying of a family, the dying, the passing on of that and the sort of tragedy of that, those old relationships. And truly, I mean, this phrase, 100 movies prove it, but you kind of learns the hard way that you can never go home again. Penn is great in the lead role, I think. But the star of the show is Gary Oldman, who plays his buddy Jackie, who's this low-level Irish mob enforcer. And I've always said it's one of my favorite. It's probably my favorite Gary Oldman performance. Just setting aside the fact that Gary's an older guy now, he's a sort of great character actor. Every time he shows up in an A-list film, he's sort of cast in an awesome role and gives us a showy and memorable performance. I feel like if you followed his career, if you pick a favorite Gary Oldman performance, you have to choose one of the ones where he was drunk all the time and just off his rocker, crazy on screen. And there were a half dozen or so movies from the early 80s to the early 90s where what you got from him was just surprising and amazing. This guy's a dangerous, murderous, temperamental gangster. We'll talk about other dangerous, fuses that you light and step away from in the movies coming up, but he's definitely that character in this. I think what's great about him and what's really great about everybody in it is that the film allows for him, and he makes it a point to find the sort of sad humanity in it. I call it, in the case of him, I call it a puppy dog humanity. There is this kid who hasn't grown up and just doesn't really get the harm that he's doing to himself and others. There's an innocence about him that I find really, really compelling. His friend has left town. He's grown up a little bit. And so it reminds me of when they bring Tom Sawyer in the middle of Huckleberry Finn, suddenly he shows up with all his fantasies and make-believe and what Huck's been through up until that point is some totally different bit of life, right? And it's a great way to show how he's grown and progressed as a character by bringing his friend in as a point of comparison. Yeah. But Robin Wright's in it, Ed Harris is in it, John Turturro, John C. Reilly in a kind of small role, but a great role. And the beauty of the movie is that they all play these sort of broken, sad losers that you kind of root for, even though you can see them sowing the seeds of their own destruction the entire film.
Yeah.
Bryan, you just watched this. What do you think?
I I was I was amazed just by the cast list, and then by the quality of the performances. They're extraordinary. You know, the movie, and I know exactly what you mean. We don't want to make too much of the movie because in some ways it doesn't fully add up or hold together. But
Sure.
I didn't care. You know, I mean,
Right.
it was just fun seeing really good actors invest fully, and I mean, they seem to really believe in this project, and they just turn in extraordinary work. So it
Yeah.
was fun for that, and it has some glorious moments. And there's, I mean, like, it's kind of hokey, but that whole St. Patty's Parade segment I liked a lot, and just the peck and paw shoot 'em up, as you mentioned to me once.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very thoughtful, character-driven work that ends with a non-spoken, spoiler alert, I guess, but a giant slow motion Sam Peckinpah-esque shootout.
Finale, yeah.
And it earns it in a way. It really does box everybody into their own corner. Nobody's going to change. The only way we're going to settle any of this is the old-fashioned way.
Mm-hmm.
So it earns that, but that was a knock on the movie at the time it came out. To me, it's hard not to see. It was hard then, but it's especially hard now not to look at it and see what a finished, polished sort of script that it is.
Yeah.
But a great view of Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan, basically on its way out in its last throes.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic cinematography by the great Jordan Cronenweth. Great music by Ennio Morricone. It's a lot to love in it. For a small, really is a small film, there's a lot to love in it.
Yeah. Ed Harris's performance is extraordinary.
It really is because he's a guy. We talked about it a little bit last week was it last week? No, 2 weeks ago with Amelia Clark. He's a guy who's putting on airs, really. He's playing at being the big boss in the Irish mob, and the character is that. He really truly is the man in charge, and he's also this guy who's in completely over his head, and he doesn't reveal that to us. He reveals it in very subtle ways throughout the film, and those sorts of things are, when you study the art of acting, those sorts of things are very, very rewarding to experience throughout the film. Ed is great in it.
Mm-hmm.
Robin Wright too is fantastic.
Yeah.
So the next up, King of New York. Let's mention King of New York, which is just essentially a backdrop for Christopher Walken to feast upon and chew up every scene and everything. But it's the Christopher Walken gangster film.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I saw King of New York, and it was my insistence that we put it on here because it really was the fifth mob movie of 1990, even though I don't have nearly as much to say about it, or I'm not a big Abel Ferrer fan, but one thing that he does know how to do, whether it's Harvey Keitel or Nick Cage, or in this case, Christopher Walken, is he knows how to take somebody who is a massive screen presence and just turn them loose. And the material allows Walken to do that. And he plays, to be fair, this is another film that really takes it walks its own path. He's a different kind of mobster than you're used to seeing in these movies. And the movies, for that reason, is a different kind of movie. So it deserves to be mentioned, even if we don't talk about it too much.
Yeah.
Bryan, have you seen King of New York? It's been a while.
long time ago. But I just remember it's sort of like glorious scene chewing from Christopher Walken. I mean, if you enjoy Christopher Walken sort of Unchained, then
he's turned up to 11 in this one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, we're not going to probably talk about King of New York very much.
I feel bad, but at least we mentioned it. We didn't just pretend it didn't exist.
Yeah, and doing some research on these films. I mean, I unfortunately can't remember. I believe it was a New York Times article that I was reading about this particular moment in 1990. It did point out this one. This one was one of the first movies to sort of acknowledge, or at least in Christopher Walken's gang, it was his use of taking African American and and having actual black people in his gang, since they were also part of this community as well.
It's made mention, and it's certainly a big part. The changing organized crime dynamics is a big part of State of Grace, even if the ethnicity is sort of left off screen in that one. It's also something they talk about in Godfather 3, which is supposedly happening in 1979.
Right.
It feels a whole lot like 1990. There's not a lot of effort made to make that 1979. Yep. So that's a thing, the you hate to talk about ethnic diversity in terms of its effect on crime in a major metropolitan area. Like, that feels like dangerous ground to be treading on, but that film makes a point of showing the diversity involved there, and the crime movies coming out of 1999, which we won't really talk about at all, but we talked about a big one last week, were all sort of based around that new ethnicity of that, which is interesting. What gangsters were and what gangs were and where that transition happened. So that's definitely something happening in here. In all these films.
The next film is a little film that it's one of those films that's tough because it's never referenced. No one really talks about it at all. It doesn't really have any sort of
famous
iconic
quotes
moments,
or anything like
quotes.
that. Yeah.
But that's it's Goodfellas.
Right.
It's one of those movies now. I mean, you could say, along with the original Godfather, probably one of the most quoted, one of the most it sort of has I was going to say it sort of has its own, it introduces its own philosophy to the world. The
some
way,
degree, I would agree
the way
with
the
that.
Godfather did, with sort of this introduction, this mentality of what it means to be a mob boss, and the head of a family. Goodfellas sort of does that as
Goodfellas. In Goodfellas, it's not family so much, which is where it spins off on its own.
Mm-hmm.
But Scorsese grew up around these people, and even though he didn't write it, there's an authenticity to Goodfellas where Godfather's sort of formalism doesn't really allow for too much of that. It's got a little bit of it.
Yeah.
But we talked about it in our Uninterrupted Shots episode, right? That first tour through the club, through the back door of the club, where you meet all of these crazy, weird personalities, and we're going to talk a lot more about Goodfellas as we went on. Goodfellas, largely in most circles, is the film, the film that won Best Film at the 91 Oscars was Dances with Wolves, which is a tonic for these kinds of movies. Really, it was this opposite of what we're talking about here. And the people, if you ask people who are super into cinema what movie got robbed at the Oscars, it's Goodfellas, and I think Scorsese as well. He certainly made a more authentic film and a more accomplished film from a movie making standpoint, but something about Dances with Wolves obviously touched the populace and the Academy voters in a way that a gangster movie almost can't at this point.
You did feel really good at the end of Dances with Wolves, though.
Yeah, I mean, all those people had to be slaughtered and whatnot, but it was all worth it.
It was all worth it
because he learned a really valuable lesson about identity and such. And he's got the girl at the end too, right? They basically ride off into the sunset together.
Yeah, with a little wolf running beside. All right. Next up is the Coen brothers Miller's Crossing, which is it's the one of these movies that doesn't take place in like current times.
it takes place. To me, Miller's Crossing. We'll get into this. I mean, the great thing about it, the very best thing about it, and probably the knock on it is that it's just a fantasy gangster land that it takes place in. It's like a theme park version of where gangsters live.
Yes.
The big peg there, the way of speaking, and some of the plot devices come from Dashiell Hammett novels. Yep. So much so that he really should be a credited writer on the script of that. He isn't, but I mean, the homages are obvious. I don't think they're trying to take credit for anybody else's work. There are obvious. But that's what's so great about it. Miller's Crossing it's the greatest bromance ever in the history of films on display for a couple of characters who are really in the end are only in a couple of scenes together, but this love between these two guys is what basically drives the whole thing, which I adore. The women are just making waves and causing problems. They're not useful at all in terms of in terms of us working towards what we think might be some semblance of a happy ending. But it's in that way, because it's a comment on gangster movies, because it's not really trying to show you actual gangsters at work in a way Goodfellas is. It's showing you gangster movie characters and then taking them in every imaginable direction you can. That's the joy of it. It's pure. There's just some unpleasantness and some tough violence and some other things, but it's pure joy when you're watching Miller's Crossing in a way that I can't really compare to any other movie from its era. I don't know, Bryan, you big Coen Brothers fan, Minnesota's own Coen Brothers.
No, yeah, I mean, maybe we'll get into this more later, but I remember just seeing both movies in 1990, and I was thunderstruck by some of those early Coen Brothers releases. But I appreciate Goodfellas a lot. It's a wonderful movie. It's an iconic film, but those two movies sort of juxtaposed with one another, to me, felt like a kind of changing of the guard for American cinema. I mean, I feel like it was like, okay, this is a great kind of Goodfellas is this kind of great crystallization of a brilliant career of Martin Scorsese. It's sort of everything that he does kind of so well encapsulated in one film, and it really works for that. But it felt like a sort of culmination in a way. And to me, the joy that you talk about in Goodfellas is so powerful in the movie making. Their mastery of tone and composition, rather Miller's Crossing, yeah. Their mastery of tone and the way they build a scene, and the and stylistically they're miles apart. But it just felt like, oh my God, these are the new sort of whatever on the mountaintop kind of filmmakers in America right now. I just so it has that, and rewatching these movies in the last weeks, it still feels that way to me.
We'll come back more, and obviously we have a lot more to say about Miller's Crossing. The final movie in this, Godfather Part 3, the long-awaited final chapter in the Corleone trilogy, or the Corleone story. I mean, pretty much the reason, probably the reason why all of these other movies came out is because this one was coming, and this was the big Christmas Day release.
Maybe it's hard to know or go back and read their minds, but it does feel a little like that. Yeah. Paramount had Coppola over a barrel in terms of him owing money to everybody, and his studio was going to go under, and his wine sales were taken off, but they weren't high enough yet that they were subsidizing all his other projects. So he basically had to do that. He did not want to make another Godfather movie. He didn't really want to make Godfather in the first place. He super didn't want to make Godfather 2. And then Godfather 3, he was pretty much coerced entirely into making. That said, when they decided they were going to do it, Mario Puzo and he got back together again and tried to make the best Godfather film that they could. They didn't want, if there was going to be another Godfather movie, and they wanted it to be really, really good. But it was And I'll just come out and say it is pretty good. That film has a really terrible reputation because it's so much not as good as the other two Godfather films, which are, 10 out of 10 star kind of just amazing pieces of work. I think, there's people argue that Godfather 2 is better than Godfather 3. We got to save all that junk for the Godfather deep dives and try and avoid that sorts of discussions. But the point is that they're really, really, really good. Godfather, until recently, it's had its place taken by Shawshank Redemption to some degree as the later generations have been added to the cinema discussion. But for a whole generation and for decades, that was considered the greatest American movie of all time. And whether you agree with that or not, it's good enough to be in that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And Godfather 2 is about as good a follow-up as you could possibly imagine to it. It's missing some things, but it adds in some other things. It's kind of amazing. So that's a legacy that's sort of unfair to try and create, decades later and just for money. And the money really did get in the way of it being good. I mean, it was beset by a couple problems. The biggest to me was that Paramount did not want to pay Robert Duvall, Oscar-winning actor Robert Duvall, on a scale that they were paying Al Pacino and Diane Keaton. And all he wanted was to be somewhere in that ballpark so that he could be recognized for what he was. And they were writing a movie. Puzo and Coppola were putting together a story where his character was integral to the story. And then suddenly, Duvall refused to do it for a pittance. And then he's taken out of it. Now that character is taken out of the story. He's a character that dies unceremoniously off screen and between movies. He's all those things you don't want from a situation like this. And it hurt that film most of all. The thing that gets most blamed is Francis Coppola replacing Winona Ryder, who had to drop out due to her doctor's orders because she was suffering from intense exhaustion from doing several movies in a row. She reluctantly dropped out of it, and it was replaced by Sofia Coppola, Francis's daughter, who gives a pretty crappy performance in it. It's not altogether bad. I think it's not nearly as bad as people make it out to be, because the people make it out to be the worst performance of all time, and it just isn't that.
Yeah.
But it does bring the movie down a little bit. That and these two old guys, to be fair, I don't think are writing for a teenager very well.
That's true. they're not
like I really don't think that Mary Corleone on the page is anywhere close to as good as like Andy Garcia's character is on the page, where you really have a lot you get to bite into there. She's this fantasy ideal of a romantic lead that these two guys came up with, and she's a schizophrenic one at that. So it's not an easy role, I think, to play.
Yeah.
Winona, no question, would have found the truth in there. Winona Ryder was the best actor of her age, of her generation. So she'd have done better, but I don't know how much better. Probably not a ton. Yeah. I mean,
Well, yeah. I mean, if the old adage is you write what you know, Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola,
they're trying to write Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
And they're just not nailing it. And I'll say one more thing about Sophia, because it's a bit of trivia that I really appreciate. She was pretty much a teenage girl. She's 19 or something. I can't remember when she did that movie. She'd acted in something before, but nothing on this scale. And the way she tells the story was that her primary concern, and it was everybody's concern, she had a dialect coach that was she spent all day trying to get her lines out of her mouth so that she didn't sound like a valley girl, because that's what she was basically. She's just trying to say the lines without an accent was a lot of work. So there wasn't a lot of room for nuances, and movie suffers because of that.
Yeah.
Bryan, you hadn't seen that until just now. You watched it with fresh eyes. We've lived with that movie for 30 years. What did you think about it now, finally seeing it?
It's hard to encapsulate. There's a lot happening there. It is It is wonderful in many respects. I guess I felt like a lot of the it was hard to know. It seemed like most of the actors were in different movies. And I think because of the sort of schizoid nature of the way it came into being, there's certain performances that to me feel like they're trying to give a Godfather performance, right? A kind of high drama read on the thing, and then there are others who just kind of rolling with it, and so you get this weird thing where a really renowned character actor like Eli Wallach looks kind of ridiculous to me in the movie, and a guy like George Hamilton looks completely at home.
Right, who would normally be somewhat ridiculous.
Yeah, George Hamilton was great in the movie, and Eli Wallach, I'm just scratching my head like, what are you thinking? And it's full of those kind of weird disconnects, and yet, Andy Garcia is amazing in the movie.
He's fantastic. He is really worth the 3 hours of your time and the price of admission alone. And I'll go one step further. Talia Shire is a character who you can track through all the movies, goes from A to B to C to D. And by the time we meet up with her in 1979, she's at U or V, and it makes sense. Like, it's a huge progression of a character, and she makes it work. She's a fun dragon lady in the film. I'll just say.
To me, the most jarring thing was how Kate Corleone dressed like Diane Keaton. Middle-aged Diane Keaton. I was like, who's doing wardrobe here? It looked like that was funny.
Well, and they're all it's all 90s fashions. The opening shot of Manhattan is 90s Manhattan. It's not 1979 Manhattan. Those buildings in the foreground weren't there because there was no Manhattan there. They built out the island so that they could have more high rises. So to me, it's like, you're like saying it's 1979. You're playing an Elvis Costello song at one point, but this really is 1990. They were not walking around dressing like that, especially the women. Women's fashions, tell you something. And I don't know, Diane Keaton. I'm sure what she was, what kind of scarf she had, and which way it was going was like a whole crew of people's jobs to figure out on that film. But it has that overblown nature to it, and yet it has these sort of lovely moments. It is schizophrenic in the way you say, but what it truly is it's two movies. There's a movie that takes place in New York. It's almost the exact first half of the movie. And there's a movie that takes place in Italy and Sicily. And that's almost the exact second half of the movie. And I have a severe lack of patience for most of the second half of the movie. And I don't want to just discredit it all because there's some neat things in there. But, especially I think Michael's visit to what we find out is the future Pope and his confession. I think that's very affecting. Some of that stuff is fantastic. Yeah. Andy Garcia plays the illegitimate son of Sonny Corleone, whose rise to power during the film is really, really fun to watch. And some of that takes place in Sicily, but Sicily's mostly, let's go visit the locations that we've seen in the other movies, and let's remember this and that. And it in the end, it's Michael's attempt to recapture some innocence that he had in his past life with his ex-wife. And of course, it works. It works like gangbusters until somebody reminds you where you are and what world you're in. It only takes a word to snap you out of that trance. It feels like, since that's the case, we spend an awful lot of time in that trance. But it's just not, people make it out to be terrible. It is in no way, shape, or form a terrible movie. It's not what it could have been, which is sad, but you can't review it for what it could have been. What's there is pretty decent. Yeah. It doesn't approach Godfather, and it doesn't, frankly, approach Goodfellas or Miller's Crossing either, but it's not bad.
So now, do you think, real quick, let's get into, do you think that when people saw The Godfather Part 3, do you think, because I think most people, some people liked it and said it's good, but pretty much it was widely agreed it is not. It was underwhelming. It did not. It was a bit of
Well,
a disappointment.
there's a Phantom Menace aspect to it. Okay, people
Yeah.
mostly did think it was good when they saw it. It was nominated for a ton of Oscars. All the Oscars it could have been nominated for. It won a couple. It, you know, at the time it was considered a big prestige picture that more or less worked with a couple of flaws. It's only in time where comedians and just all of us critics, the discourse of the thing, we all want to throw a label at something. We're so desperate to do it that we ignore nuances at the expense of just saying you failed, you're a failure. You know, Sophia's not just an unfortunately naive performance, it's the worst performance by an actor ever. You know,
Yeah.
those things just aren't. If you think that, not watching enough movies,
Mhm.
you know, truly.
But my point being is do you think it was sort of viewed as a disappointment in comparison to other Godfather films, or do you think that the fact that there were 4 other gangster films that came out in just the few weeks prior to it,
it's both.
that by the time
It's both,
get
and
to
it probably
Godfather,
could. Yeah, it probably could have survived the former, but the latter, the other better movies of its type surrounding it, really did sort of finalize it, because people still love Miller's Crossing and Goodfellas. They're really the two to compare it to. I don't think many people were comparing State of Grace or King of New York to it.
I
To each other.
Yeah, I found this this New York Times article by Jason Bailey. This was actually just from September, but he talks about, you know, yeah, there were you know, pretty burnt. People were pretty burnt out, or critics at least were burnt out, sort of on gangster films by the time Godfather 3 comes out, and also because, you know, State of Grace, King of New York, Goodfellas, Miller's Crossing to a little bit of extent, but certainly in those 3, we see a lot more of the life of the underlings as opposed to what it's like being the boss. You know, we're getting into and that by the time you get to Godfather 3, and we're sort of it's almost this throwback type of film. People have already had sort of that more visceral, exciting, you know, much more, I guess, active, maybe is not the right word, but sort of a gangster thing that
Here, I'll tell you this, and this will make everyone feel sad. So whatever, here I come, raining on your parade. Coppola's original concept for Godfather 3 was for Robert Duvall's character and Michael Corleone, Al Pacino, to over this massive deal that they were trying to take place. Ended up being at the Vatican, but it was vague for a while as to what it was going to be. That they were going to essentially break over that. And it was going to be cross-cut with the like late 30s version of Sonny adopting Duvall's character, you know, as kids, and them experiencing that, exactly what you're talking about, that view from the ground level of a gangster organization, even though they were the son and adopted son of a big mob boss. They still were going to grow up together, and we were going to experience that. That was what the film was supposed to be, until Robert Duvall didn't get to be in it. That, just hearing that always makes me go, oh, that's the movie. I mean, that's the movie that had the potential to be as good as the other films, right? What they ended up with isn't bad, but it doesn't have the potential to be as good as the other ones. It just can't. It tries, but it can't quite manage it. Those two things juxtaposed with Sonny's illegitimate son taking over the organization and being sort of the trump card in the fight between the thinking side and the passionate side of the Corleone family, is the idea of that, and the thematic richness of that is, I mourn for the loss of that film, because that's the movie that would have been great. And we just can't. You're trying to review as I say, we always try and not review what isn't there. You try and not review the thing for what you want it to be, but for what it ended up being.
Right.
But it goes along with what you're saying.
Well, and
it was going to be both. It was going to be both, and it ended up being kind of only the other thing.
Yeah.
And Diane Keaton and her agent had a lot to do with that. And Paramount not paying Robert Duvall had a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
But I think it's that story that you tell, that there's so many components that go to making a really, a realized, a film, totally realized film like Godfather 1 or Godfather 2. I think that there's so many things that have to coalesce and work synchronously to make that happen. And then you see, knowing that, it's like, okay, so it's like cutting the legs out from under the movie before shooting even starts. And then you're left with this thing, and you've got to patch together something. And it kind of explains why it soars in places, and in places it's kind of shocking the extent to which it misses the mark. It's just sort of like we're just making this thing, I don't know, cobbling together this sort of cinematic Frankenstein. So it's kind of fascinating with that backstory to watch the movie through. I mean, you talked to me about this a little before I watched the movie, and I think it's what lends that kind of, as I said, I think initially that you're left with a lot of really fine actors, some of whom don't seem to know what movie they're in, because I don't think they knew when they were shooting it what movie they were in. Right. Because it's not exactly a Godfather movie, but you see them trying, even though the script doesn't really allow for that, and other elements don't allow for that. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, a movie that everybody knows what kind of movie they're in from the very start, because the style and the type of movie it is almost a whole nother character. Of course, is Miller's Crossing. That movie,
that really is just a love letter to gangster movies.
Yeah.
It is. I don't want to sell it out as not being what it is on the ground. The plot, the characters, what their motivations are, those are all beautiful and well thought out things. But there's another level to that film that none of these other movies have. They're trying to tell you a story straight up.
Yeah.
And the Coens are truly commenting on a form, in a way that should take you out of it a little emotionally, and maybe it does. It allows you to kick back a little bit and be a little more comfortable with the goings on in the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the best plotted film of the three. I mean, Goodfellas has a chaos to it that is kind of exhilarating and wonderful, and believable because it's that way. It doesn't, Miller's Crossing's this puzzle where every piece fits perfectly.
Yeah,
even though there's plenty of surprises in it,
mm-hmm.
Everything is earned, everything is foreshadowed and shown brilliantly, and everybody is just balls out playing these sort of iconic types of people we've seen in cinema.
Yeah.
But they're imbuing them with real, I don't want to call it reality, but take John Turturro. John Turturro has never been better and will never be better than he is in Miller's Crossing. He is brilliant in it. I mean, it's just brilliant in it. The few moments, he's only in this scene or that scene. He's in the big iconic, that you always see on the posters and stuff. The guy with the gun held at the forehead of the guy in the empty field of the titular place that, begging for his life. And that scene is, I mean, it's cinema perfection. It's hard to believe it could manage that if the film was really trying to tell you the story of a group of actual people,
right,
instead of just a bunch of gangster characters in the coolest gangster story of all time.
Yeah,
I mean, it manages to pull off somehow.
Like when I remember researching this film back in college many moons ago. We're talking about our college
just a few years after it came out.
Yeah,
at that point,
yeah.
right?
But I just remember, you know, it's
Back in the early 90s.
because you think about Coen Brothers films, and you're just like, you know, it feels like they always go, well, we have this type of movie. How do we turn it on its ear? And for this, it's like, we want to do a gangster movie. How do we turn it on its ear? It's like, well, what if at least one of the gangsters had a strong sense of ethics? And you know, it's like, how do you introduce, it's that you know, it's that honor among thieves, it's that, you know, the whole thing. Well, you know, the whole idea of ethics and trust and double crossing and things like, you know, the machinations of a mob, and it just really kind of turns it on its ear of how, well, you know, there has to be some rules or this won't work. And so it's like, well, how, you know, and that's, that to me, yeah, and that is how it sort of, like you said, it kind of goes into this fantasy world of what
each character in that film proves their own point. They all have life philosophies that come out during the discourse of the thing, and they all end up proving their own points, to good or ill for them, mostly ill.
Yeah. And the only one who really doesn't is Gabriel Byrne. He never really, like, John Turturro fully says, well, you can never have too many friends. You know what I say? And then, right. You know, and the other guy's like, well, you know, John Polito, what's his first name?
John Polito.
John Polito.
Johnny Casper is the character.
Casper. You know, he's like, you know, there's, you know, you can't have, once you start double crossing, when does the double crossing stop? So you know, you have to be straight up. You have to, you know, and you know, everyone sort of has it. And
he's got a point. He's proven right.
Yeah, and
our hero more or less takes his side against his best friend right from the beginning of the movie. It's kind of where we start things going. It's like we talked about it last week, or again, it was 2 weeks ago. Sorry, Shauna, for talking about last week. Like I've forgotten. I haven't. It's like the turning point in Shakespeare. It happens in the. It's like Lear. It happens in the first scene, and there's no going back after that. And yet, where that normally you'd like your turning point to happen a little later, so that the whole thing just doesn't feel like some inevitable tragedy. The way it plays out in Miller's Crossing is rather brilliant, and I would argue with you that our main character ultimately suffers more than anybody. He's left standing at the end and looking cool with his hat. But he can't be best friends with his best friends anymore. He can't be with his lover anymore. His whole movie, he's been trying to keep the gang together, and he is the only way to save it is to betray it and to leave it forever.
Yeah.
And yet he does that out of this true brotherly love for the character played by the great actor Albert Finney.
Yeah.
And Albert Finney, you know, at the beginning is kind of important, but he's barely in the movie, and he's asked to say and do things that are really kind of pathetic. And yet the movie gives him that one gift, that Tommy gun shootout assault home invasion.
I know, it's crazy.
Where you see what the man is. You see why our hero loves him. You see what he is absent any of those other forces working on his life. Why he's kind of worth fighting for, you know, not just that he's a badass, but that he does it with grace, you know, and style.
Yeah.
Pulling the cigar out of the smoking jacket at the end and gunning down those bad guys. I mean, it's the epitome of cool. It's the coolest thing I've ever seen anyone do in a film ever. It's just really, because it's heightened, and because the Coens aren't storytellers, they are, but they aren't in a conventional sense. They're artists commenting on a form. And because they're able to pull all that stuff off. Whereas in any of these other movies, even Goodfellas, which is pretty over the top, it would seem ridiculous. It would seem cartoonish. Yeah. But that's the glory of it. They're archetypes And as much as the actors work to make them characters, in the end, they're still archetypes that you just love watching on screen.
Yeah.
Brian, you can tell me if I'm wrong about that, but that's always been my take on Miller's Crossing.
No, I think you nailed it. They very much are. It's it is a love ode to gangster movie.
Right.
And
in that respect, it's perfect. It's a perfect film. There's really not a note or a line or a leaf out of place in any of the shots. It's delightfully perfect.
What is I do think Gabriel Byrne though has his own sort of philosophical tagline too. He says a couple of times, "Nobody knows anybody."
Oh, that's
Not
true.
that
Yeah,
well.
you're right. Yeah, you're right. I did forget about that. That is his go-to line.
And he's right.
And he's right because it comes down to, you know, when he's like, "What heart?" And it's really great. Let's move into
Packed to the rafters with fantastic performances at every level.
Oh.
Steve Buscemi, you already said John Polito, amazing in it. J.E.
So
Freeman is incredible in it.
Mhm.
J.E. Freeman as the Dane, Eddie Dane, replaced Peter Stormare, who they couldn't get at the last second, who was going to play the Swede. And as great as Peter Stormare and as great a work as he has done with the Coens in future films, particularly Fargo, but others, it was a coup that they ended up with J.E. Freeman playing Eddie Dane, because Freeman is menacing in a down-to-earth and grounded way in which Peter Stormare's insanity could never be, in my opinion. J.E. Freeman is hate for women, hate for smartasses, hate for everybody around him, and personified, and yet there's still a semblance of a person behind his eyes, which makes it even that much more terrifying. He's one of the best bad guys in all the movies. I already said Albert Finney. You can't say enough about him. Marcia Gay Harden. Without her, the movie doesn't really work either.
It's my favorite Marcia Gay Harden part, I think.
Oh, it's so good. And it's all good. So Barry Sonnenfeld stuff, Carter Burwell's music.
I want to also want to point out Mike Starr, who plays like the big giant, the big galoot.
The big galoo. That's what I would call him too.
The big henchman for Casper. The moment when Gabriel Byrne's character is supposed to get roughed up for turning down an offer, and he walks up and Gabriel Byrne smashes him with the chair, and he's like, "Come on, Tom."
Even better, before that, he holds his hand up and starts to take his jacket off, and Mike Starr's like,
Mike Starr's like, of course.
It's the whole thing being a gangster is as evil and violent as it is, it's a gentlemanly affair.
And his come on, Tom, and he walks out of it, and he walks out, and Gabriel Byrne has no idea what's about to happen. He just sees this guy, and then everything comes in. Oh God, that part cracks me up every time. I just lose it. I want to move on because we were talking about the sort of the craziness and the I want to say vitality. I don't think that's the word you used, Ryan, but I can't. I'm not remembering it.
No, but that's a good word for Goodfellas.
Yeah, for Goodfellas. Yeah.
There's a chaos to it.
That's the word you use.
It starts out. It's a brilliant movie in the way that it starts out as a very mannered, almost corny, you're introduced to this old school, like Atlantic City version of being a gangster in New York, and the glitz and glamour of it, the crazy characters, what's this, Johnny Two Times or whatever. They go through the whole list of them, all these dudes who are all known by their nicknames that stand for their affectations. That's delightful. Of course, the movie ends where it's not the 50s anymore. It's the 70s. Everybody's stoned out of their mind on cocaine. They don't know what planet they're on. The feds are coming down on them from all angles. Like it slowly moves from being a fantasy of becoming a gangster to the harsh, awful reality of being a gangster in an era that wasn't built to accommodate you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in that way, it's great. And it's inspired by a lot of stuff that really happened to real people, and that the truth of that comes across in the film really, really well. And of course, it has one of the greatest. We were talking about Gary Oldman, who I love. but it has the greatest, short fused character of all time, but Joe Pesci's character with the "Do I amuse you?" I mean,
this absolute.
That scene is, again, cinema legend. You almost can't do a scene like that anymore. It's delivered on that, right? And I find that very, very joyful. I find the triangle of people, Robert De Niro's character, Pesci's, and Leota's, you get invested in them, even though you figure they're doomed and you kind of hope they are. If there's any justice in the world, you still give a crap about them in a way that's important. The movie sort of loses me near the end because I get exhausted by it as much as I'm thrilled by it. The difference between exhilaration and exhaustion, it's a fine line. And by the time Goodfellas is over, I'm like, thank God it's over. Where for even Godfather 3, I do not exactly feel that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But Goodfellas it's a masterwork too, by a guy who basically been telling the same story, whether it was in Jesus' time in, Jerusalem, or whether it was on this side of New York or that side or whatever.
Yep.
I don't know if it's as good as, maybe not as good as Taxi Driver, or maybe not as good as Raging Bull, but the point is it's one of a piece, right? It fits right in that group, and it's as good as any of those movies. So that's saying a lot.
I love how it for me, it was the first time I really can remember where it sort of deals with the mundane it's like the whole Sopranos, the whole idea behind Sopranos was the everyday sort of mundane elements of a life when you're as part of a crime family. This is the first time I think I remember sort of seeing anything like that, where it's just like the whole helicopter scene, the one day, the May 11th or whatever it is, I can't remember what day it was, but the one day where he's like, I gotta go do this, I gotta do this, and I'm making dinner, and it's got to be this, and and I'm trying to do this, and I told my brother to make sure he's watching the sauce, and and that whole scene where it's balancing just living, the mundane aspects of living your life with, I gotta get guns to my guy from Pittsburgh or whatever it is, and
and before we turn it over to Bryan, there's another thing that sets this movie aside, and that's the voiceover. This film has almost as much voiceover as it has actual dialogue within the film. It has the most voiceover of any movie I'd seen to that point. It was beaten by Scorsese's Casino, by the same writer a few years later, which somehow has even more voiceover in it. I don't know how. But what you're saying, it goes along with that internal dialogue, that you're very much being told a story of what is happening to this guy as it's happening.
Yeah. Makes
it unique. That's an old school gangster style thing that all the rest of these movies sort of eschew and move on from, that Goodfellas completely embraces. What do you got to say, Bryan, about Goodfellas?
I mean,
that you haven't already said.
Yeah, it's just it's a, it's, I mean, you mentioned the steady camp scene. It's got all this sort of iconic stuff, but it was, watching it again just a couple weeks ago, is just, I don't have anything brilliant to add. I just feel like it's a hell of a fine movie, and not my favorite Scorsese. I love some of his oddball movies, like After Hours, probably more. And I do love
After Hours is great.
I love, Taxi Driver, to me, is kind of perfect, and but it's just the mundane thing that you'd mentioned, they even the mundane aspects of having a girl on the side,
Yeah.
Right. It's perfunctory.
Yeah, it's just kind of, okay, that's part of the life, but it gets to be a drag and a hassle at times. I mean, there's a lot of hassle and drag going on in the life, glamorous lives of these gangsters.
And it's like that's why he's so hopped up on cocaine all the time, is because he's he's just got to get through doing all of this stuff, and his work-life balance is just off, and so he compensates with cocaine. So, yeah. And then so in State of Grace is, something a little bit more, that's more like the well, I almost gave away a big plot point in State of Grace.
Yeah, we try not to do that. It's hard not to do.
I'm glad I caught myself.
I appreciate that you did. Though.
Yeah, I was about to make a comparison in State of Grace, but I realized if I do that,
it's important in the plot of State of Grace. But you could argue that the meaning of the film, it's not that those identity issues really are not the issue. I mean, the movie really is about it's about whatever the reason. It's about going home again, and how you kind of destroy the thing by reintegrating yourself into it. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, you're entering a world that is eating its own tail anyway. And that's what he finds when he gets there. It's a character movie first and foremost. That theme is resonant, and it's got sort of a plot to it, but not really. The plot is a reactionary to all these foibles and bad luck things that happen to these guys because of who they are.
Sure. Yeah.
And the decisions that even the what we'll ostensibly call the bad guys have to make to keep the peace in the wake of the insanity of being an organized crime, hit person are intolerable, and yet you kind of have to do them. My favorite scene in it is for one reason or another, one of our main characters and another, it's Gary Oldman's character and Sean Penn's character, they've been told to hold up in this attic in this warehouse and wait until they get a phone call, and then they should come out guns blazing. They're going to start a war. That's all they can do to save themselves. Or was it that they were supposed to wait until they didn't get a call and come? And that's the argument that's happening. Mm-hmm. They're sitting there. They all got Uzis and automatic weapons, and they're on the edge of going to battle in the streets of Manhattan. And they're arguing over, they were going to call, or it wasn't going to call. Which is it? And there's so much tension in that. I adore that scene. The reasons why it's happening are important, don't get me wrong, but it's just what it is for its own sake. That's what's so delightful about it. The guy I forgot to mention in that film too is Burgess Meredith. It shows up briefly in it, and it's a heartbreaking and beautiful performance, one of Burgess's final screen performances, and it's totally worthy of him. I'm just an old man eating stewed tomatoes out of a can.
All right.
And his sigh of relief when the guy showed up to collect money from him, leaves his apartment, I get to live another day. It's nothing short of that. Yeah. It's a really, really awesome little cameo by him that I like.
So as we're wrapping this thing up, if all of these movies, if you can make it, if you can tie a straight line from essentially all of these movies back to Godfather 1 and Godfather 2, the sort of when there were the gangster films of the 30s and 40s and stuff like that, and then there's the Godfather, and
the movie that turned it into high drama. And so then our version of a film that takes place at court in England.
Exactly. So then you got that, and then the straight line is drawn to these films, where these films have a little bit more to do with the machinations, the worker bees, the worker ants that are sort of make the engine go, and then we get then it continues on in Goodfellas, and then leading on into the next generation of sort of gangster films, well,
you said it,
Dogs,
to top these, it's sort of, it took a completely different perspective. Gangster movies turned to African Americans, real gang work, the actual drug wars, that sort of thing. I mean, it needed that to evolve. When we went back to the old Italian gangsters of New York, of the East Coast, it took a TV show that could really breathe and take its time and really be a character study to be able to tell that kind of story effectively again, I think.
So where do we think it goes from here? I mean, do you think that we get back into more the where we are looking at the top people again, you know, where it's mostly, you know, do you guys have any thoughts about where the gang, you know, or where the gangster genre could go? Any thoughts on that?
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, this is all just speculation.
Well, look, it's always fun to travel back in time to a time when organized crime was all done by white folks and where drugs weren't really part of it. It was just molasses and, you know, gambling fees. And, you know, I mean, that's romantic.
Protection in, you know, the neighborhood.
Right. I mean, we've had those stories told. The Sopranos definitely, but I would say Boardwalk Empire as well. It's a really, really important Prohibition era look at what it's like to be a corrupt public official amongst all this crime, and really how the crime was. I don't know. That's an interesting story. I mean, it makes the case that Prohibition was brought about by women being able to vote. Which is true to some degree, that it's not likely that passes as a you know, a constitutional element unless it was women getting sick of being beaten by their alcoholic husbands all the time. I mean, that's really what was going on there. And how that essentially created organized crime, right? That era is fun to relive from a fashion standpoint. The cars look cool. The shootouts are always fun, but what you can bring that's new to it is tougher at this point.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the future of gangster movies are, but you do have to choose if you're going to, you know, what is organized crime? What is it even these days?
Sure. Yeah.
Is anyone telling that story? There's some interesting stories of 70s.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah, you bring up a good point.
American Gangster, Ridley Scott's film with Denzel Washington. That is a spectacular movie. That's based on a real story, stuff like that. But that's all biography. None of it's going to reinvent the genre anymore, I don't think.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, it's these iconic genres where like westerns or gangster films. They seem, I think, periodically to have kind of run their course. We've exhausted this one, but there's always a new generation of talent who sees it with fresh eyes and finds new angles to present it in startling and fresh.
Or the old generation gets motivated to tell the same story again, but from a different point of view, like in The Irishman, which is a fantastic movie.
Wonderful movie. In fact, I would argue that The Irishman may be better than Casino or Goodfellas.
It's certainly better than Casino. Goodfellas it's right there with it. I would argue it's by a more mature director who's lived longer and is more philosophical at this point. So it doesn't have that same wacky, crazy energy to it, but it's more contemplative and more adult, and it might resonate longer because of that, I think.
You know, in a weird way, it's about, I mean, I think that there's there's about that element of loss and regret and that mournfulness and that ache. You know, we started off mentioning briefly Gangster 1, but I remember when I got that piece of material and I'm like, why would anyone care about this? Is there anything redemptive in this thing at all? And I think ultimately it is about diminishment of vitality and of youth, and so that bringing that into it sort of brought it full circle. And I think that's what you see in The Irishman too, that makes it so potent in a surprising way.
And Gangster number 1 is a movie out there. The movie doesn't quite capture the soul of the play.
So Melis and Cinto cut ties to it, the writers of Gangster 1. They didn't, you know, they were involved initially, and I think they're credited as screenwriters, but they disavow.
They're credited as written the play that it's adapted from. Of course, their own screenplay, Sexy Beast, is much closer to the type of thing that they're. That's also from last week. That's one of Shauna's favorite movies too. So Sexy Beast, if you want to watch a different take on a gangster movie, it's definitely another one. So the possibilities are endless, but who's the next person to redefine that shit? If I could answer that, I'd be making a gangster movie and making $1 million. I don't know. It's a great question, but it's tough to answer.
So, well, thank you 1990 for that weird little for that concentration of gangster films, and and frankly the amount of influence these movies have on movies that have come after it is pretty startling, pretty apparent. I mean, you can go, oh, that they're directly taking, if it's from music cues to scenery and things like that. Oh, that's directly taken. Boy, they're doing a Miller's Crossing right there, or they're doing a Goodfellas.
Can I make a little unrelated joke?
Always.
Once, before Neil Peart died, when Rush came on, they didn't do many talk shows. I don't think they were asked to do many, but they wouldn't do them anyway. But they came on the Colbert Report, and Stephen Colbert asked them, have you ever written a song so long that by the end of the song you were influenced by yourselves earlier in the song? which got them to laugh out loud, which I thought was pretty funny. I don't know if that's relevant here. I feel like it kind of is, even if it completely isn't. But so I'll repeat that funny Colbert joke.
All right. So, well, Bryan, thank you so much for joining us to talk about these gangster films of the 90s, or of 1990. I keep wanting to say of the 1990, but it was just that.
Yeah, like you say, all within about 3 months of each other. Pretty amazing.
It was great to have you. So, dear listener, if you have any thoughts on these particular movies, are we selling King of New York short? Do you have an impassioned plea to say, King of New York, no, that's better than all of these? Please, of course, reach out to us at Ask Joel and Ryan on Twitter and Instagram, The Movie Show with Joel and Ryan page on Facebook, The Movie Show with Joel and Ryan page on YouTube. And if you're watching this, you already know where that is. You can leave comments below. You can
also, we did a lot of work not to spoil State of Grace for you. So don't go reading an online review of that before you watch it. If you feel like you're going to watch it anyway, you'd be doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah. And of course, askjoelandryan@gmail.com. So that is going to do it for us this week. Bryan, thank you so much again for coming on and joining us. So great to see you, my friend.
Nice.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks for your expertise in storytelling and performance. We've got to utilize you more in the coming months and years, hopefully.
Yeah.
Anytime.
You're in now. You're part of the family. You're a made man.
Exactly.
It didn't feel like an initiation at all.
All right, everybody. You have a good week, and until next time, thank you for joining us on The Movie Show with Joel and Ryan.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for listening to The Movie Show with Joel and Ryan. Remember, all views and opinions represented in this podcast are personal and belong solely to the speaker and do not represent those people, institutions, or organizations that the speaker may or may not be associated with, unless explicitly stated. None of these views and opinions were intended to malign or deceive. And now, here's the producers, circa 1982, to play us out.